Welcome to Exploring AI Matters. This podcast series, previously known as Mind the Gap Dialogues on Artificial Intelligence, will continue to appear in the ABA series to the extent that, in addition, all of the episodes, old and new, will now appear under our new podcast name, Exploring AI Matters. Thank you.
No area of activity has so distinguished natural intelligence from artificial intelligence than creative arts like music, drama, poetry, painting, and dance. While AI researchers have built software that tries to create art, the results have been profoundly disappointing. Weird dramas, strange poetry, and sounds that only the authors would call music. In this episode of Mind the Gap, Dialogues on Artificial Intelligence, we will consider the application of AI techniques to help people better understand one of the greatest paintings in the world, Rembrandt van Rijn's The Night Watch. This famous painting is the premier cultural icon of the Netherlands and the centerpiece of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. The painting has a long and complex history. It has been housed in several locations over the centuries. It has been the subject of numerous conservation projects over its nearly 4 centuries of existence. One of the less known episodes in the painting's past occurred in 1715 when pieces of the colossal painting were cut off in order to fit it into the Amsterdam town hall. The cutting was particularly egregious on the left side of the painting, whence the images of 3 people in the original were lost. While the removed sections of the canvas have not been found, a small copy, which survives, was made by another painter not long after The Night Watch was completed. Working from images of the copy, along with remarkably detailed photographic images of the original, Dr. Robert Erdmann has used AI to approximately reconstruct the lost portions of the canvas. Dr. Erdmann is the senior scientist at the Rijksmuseum and also a professor at the University of Amsterdam, where he holds appointments in 2 departments, the Institute of Physics and the Department of Conservation and Restoration of Cultural Heritage. The objective of the reconstruction work was to make them as similar as possible to the original. In today's episode, we will discuss with Dr. Erdmann how he went about this remarkable and inspiring recreation. Hello, I'm Mark Donner, a computer scientist.
And I am Roland Trope, a national security lawyer. We are your hosts for this episode of Mind the Gap, Dialogues on Artificial Intelligence.
In addition, we have 2 more hosts. Amma Adams, a national security lawyer, cannot be with us today.
And I'm Charles Palmer, another computer scientist.
Good evening, Dr. Erdmann. How did you get involved initially with AI?
Well, AI is something that I've been following for quite some time. In my previous position, I was a professor at the University of Arizona, working on completely different things. But among them was to try to understand the relation between material properties and material structure. And there were such amazing advances in AI at the time that I figured, well, I should probably learn about this field and see if there's some way to apply it to the physical sciences. So back then, I didn't really have access to the right hardware or really the developments that enable the application towards physics weren't really there yet. But it's something I kind of kept my finger on to monitor it. And yeah, it's had such a massive explosion in utility all across computer science and now in the conservation world that I just decided to stick with it and learn everything I could about it.
So is it fair to say that you got interested in it early on and you've kind of self-taught yourself, or have you taken courses also to get up to speed? Because that sounds like a formidable challenge.
Yeah, it turns out that most of AI, the basic concepts are actually quite simple. I mean, if you understand linear algebra, and I did because I was also professor in applied mathematics at my last university, then you really have quite a head start. But certainly, any online class I could get my hands on, I've taken it. Some of the Stanford courses by Andrei Karpathy about convolutional neural networks for computer vision and so on were classes that I took when they first came out. And yeah, really, these days, there are so many excellent tutorial videos or entire courses on YouTube that anyone who really wants to can do it, I think.
Could we ask you, how did you come to be working as senior scientist at the Rijksmuseum? I didn't even know they had a senior scientist.
Yeah, the story is long and winding, so I'll abbreviate it. But basically, in my last job, I was working on something completely different. Basically, my main project was solidification of aluminum alloys in microgravity. So I had an experiment on the International Space Station. About as far away from museum things as you can imagine. But one of the women I shared an office with in graduate school actually went on to working in the conservation field, and I ended up visiting her at the Art Institute of Chicago and got a really nice behind-the-scenes tour. And before this, I didn't really have any concept of what happened at a museum. I sort of thought of an art museum was the place where art went to die. And so this really opened up my eyes to all of the amazing things that are happening behind the scenes to make sure that the museum continues to run, of course, but studying all of the artworks, understanding where they came from, what has happened to them since they were made, what will happen to them under various conservation treatments and so on. And at that point, I decided, wow, this is so cool. I mean, I had no idea that people did that for a living. So I decided to sort of fake it till I made it, as they say. And I had been doing some really large image processing work for my space solidification experiments. And so I asked if there was a way that this might transfer over. And it turned out that they were struggling with stitching X-ray films, because when you X-ray a painting to see what might be painted behind it, you use chest-size X-rays. So if you have a really big painting, then you have a lot of X-rays. And in those days, this was 2004 or 5, that's really a lot more than the average computer could handle. So I sort of injected myself into that. And in the end, I got to serve as a resident fellow here in the Netherlands, working with other museums to try to apply imaging and computation technologies in the museum field at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study. And at the end of that, I was basically invited to come here permanently. So I agreed to do so if I could somehow find a position in a university at the same time as a museum, because I love the academic freedom, but I also wanted to make sure that the work I was doing was immediately applicable. Instead of writing papers about what I would do, I wanted to make sure that it was in the hands of people who were going to use it now. And here I am 7 years later.
Before you took the position, was there a senior scientist, or did they create the position for you?
There was not a senior scientist position. I mean, now we have a science department with a number of student researchers and postdocs and so on. But at the time, I was the only scientist at the museum. Yeah.
In our preliminary conversation last week, you mentioned that the reconstruction effort was part of a larger project involving Rembrandt's The Night Watch. Can you give us some idea of the nature of both projects, their relationship, and what the comparative efforts are in each?
Yeah, so as mentioned, the Night Watch is probably the most important artwork in the museum. A large fraction of our visitors come specifically to see the painting. And the museum is almost a cathedral built around this painting. It's at the end of this long gallery of honor. So we are in the middle of what we call Operation Night Watch, which is a multi-year, multi-million euro initiative split into two halves. The first is a research half, and the second is a conservation half. And the idea is that we will sort of think about taking a patient to a doctor. The first half is like conducting a full body scan. So we're going to try to use every scientific technique available, all the most modern imaging techniques and computation where appropriate, to obtain a comprehensive understanding of what the state of the painting is now, how it was made, what layers have been built up, what conservation problems may exist. And then we're done with that first half. And the second half is to be completed. And that will involve a conservation treatment of some sort. So we're still in the process of digesting all the scientific results and deciding what kind of conservation treatment will be appropriate. And this whole operation, what's unusual about this is that the whole thing is done in front of the public. So there's a big glass house, as we call it, a four-sided glass enclosure that's built around the painting. It's quite a large picture. It's 4.5 meters wide by, so that's 15 feet, and a little under 4 meters tall. So it's a really big painting. And all of the research, as well as all of the future conservation treatments, will be done inside this glass house in front of the public while they watch. So the reconstruction, this missing parts that you mentioned, is being displayed to the public right now in this 3-month sort of interregnum between the research phase and the conservation phase, while we digest the research data to decide what the conservation treatment will be, with the help of outside experts and people from many different disciplines, to make sure that we really make the very best conservation treatment that we can make.
Can I ask 2 other brief questions? First,
sure.
For people who may not, and I realize this, it's possible a lot of people may not have seen the Night Watch. What's the painting of, just so the audience gets a sense of it? Why is it such a cultural icon in the Netherlands?
So the official title of the painting is quite a mouthful, but essentially it is a militia company portrait. Its actual name is not the Night Watch, but what it shows is the militia company for the 2nd district in Amsterdam. And so at the time, you had sort of civic guards, each of whom, which would be organized from members of the public, each of whom was responsible for protecting or defending a certain area of the city. So the tradition at the time is that they would commission a portrait of themselves, each company, with the most prominent figures, the leaders of the company in front. And the typical militia company portrait would be a bunch of these guys sitting around a table, drinking beer and stuff. So Rembrandt decided to, as he often did, to turn the whole genre on its head and to make an action shot where they're basically the leader, Frans Bonning-Koch, and his lieutenant, Willem van Rasenberg, are standing near the center of the painting, and Rasenberg is getting ready to follow, and Bonning-Koch is gesturing out to get his whole company to march out. So they're basically going to march out to defend the city. It's a very raucous scene with a lot of movement and so on. And it's come to sort of symbolize, Dutch civic pride, as well as the fact that the Dutch, they really prided themselves on having this locally organized militias instead of, being a military power. They were a trading power, of course. So it sort of symbolizes the Dutch way.
One last question as transition to Mark. Is this the first effort of its kind that you know of, either in the Netherlands or the world, so that everything you're doing, you're sort of having to invent for the purpose, or are you building on other conservation efforts that have been done elsewhere?
Well, as far as the reconstruction of the missing pieces, I think that's new, because this is a very unusual situation, of course. The fact that the Night Watch was cut down, that is not so uncommon. Many paintings were cut down. But the fact that someone made a copy of it, a fairly faithful, semantically faithful, if you will, copy of it before it was cut down, is very unusual. So there was not really much to draw on, where you would try to use a painting from a different painter before the damage to try to learn a translation back into the style of Rembrandt, to help envision what those missing pieces might have looked like before they were cut off.
In the beginning of the reconstruction, you have two collections of images, one of the surviving area of the Night Watch and one of a smaller copy made by another artist. Can you give us an idea of how you reconstructed the missing pieces?
Sure. The smaller copy is made by a painter named Gerrit Lundens. And as far as we know, it was commissioned by Frans Bonningkok, the main figure. And it was commissioned to sit, to hang on his wall. So it's less than 1/5 full scale. So what you have here is a different painter. The painting is on wooden panel, whereas the Night Watch is on canvas. And it's a much different scale. And of course, when you paint something smaller, you leave out certain details, and the way that you paint faces is quite different than when you paint them large scale. So the challenge is to overcome all of these differences, essentially. You have a different palette that the two artists used, so the colors are different. You have different painterly style. You have a different texture because one is on canvas and one is on panel, and they were using different size brushes and so on. So broadly, I approached this task in three main steps. The first was to do what I would call semantic matching. So the copy that was made, I should say, was faithful in the sense of leaving in all of the things that were in the Night Watch. You know, if there was a button on a hat, then he also painted a button on a hat. And if there were 4 stars over here, he painted 4 stars and so on. But geometrically, it was not a perfect grid scale copy. So you can't simply blow up the copy and lay it on top of the Night Watch and have it match. So if I'm going to have the computer recreate the missing parts, I have to have it so that those missing parts are perfectly contiguous with the existing painting. So I can't just blow up the small copy by Lundens by 5x and then translate those parts and stick them on the painting, because then they won't align. So I have to make sure that things geometrically align. And so the way I did this was to, again, there's 3 neural networks that are at work here. The first neural network was trained to identify semantic matches between the 2 paintings. So that is to say, oh, there's a face and there's an eye and there's a pupil of the eye. And here is the same face, although it has a different appearance, of course. Semantically, it's the same guy and the same eye. And so I can make 10,000 or so matches, the tip of the spear, the tip of the spear, the heel of the boot, and so on, across the entire painting. And so this set of semantic matches would then allow me to solve for the kind of deformation which we call homography, but it's essentially all the kinds of deformations that you might see if you were to move the camera. That is to say, if you move the camera closer or farther, you get bigger and smaller images. If you tilt the camera around its main axis, then you get rotation. And then you can tilt the camera, yaw and pitch. And these will cause perspective distortions. For example, the parts that are farther away become smaller and the parts that are closer become bigger. So these are broadly called homographies in mathematical terms. And so I then use this set of matches to have the computer solve for the best homography, because various things could have happened to the Night Watch since it was painted. It might have been stretched, it might have been skewed and taken off of its strainer and so on. So I don't have perfect confidence that the shape of the Night Watch now is the same as it used to be. And also, it seems that there's some strange deformations in the upper right corner of the Lundens copy that give a sense that he was sort of trying to use perspective tricks because he couldn't measure it. So the bottom half of the painting is quite geometrically faithful, and it seems that the faithfulness geometrically kind of falls off above the height that one might be able to reach with a measuring stick on the painting. This is just hypothesis. It seems also that Lundens had some perspective effects, unintentional. Having done that, then the 2 images were much more closely aligned, but still if you look closely, you can see that London's sometimes makes a face too narrow, or he stretches it out, or the head is tilted slightly, and so on. And what I would like when I'm teaching the computer in the final step to translate from this copy to Rembrandt is to understand how to translate the palette. I want to understand how to translate the texture, the sort of brush strokes and so on. But I do not want to teach the computer bad habits about stretching faces and things like that, because I don't have enough faces where I have London's painted it this way and Rembrandt painted it that way to teach the computer any kind of sense of what the right thing is to do. There's only 17 people in the whole painting. So what I wanted to do was to make a training set that could teach the computer to the things that I want without teaching it bad habits. So that's the second part. The second part was then, given these pretty closely aligned images on the big scale, to zoom in and then to have the computer tweak and nudge and pull like a rubber sheet the copy so that each of its details was perfectly falling on top of the corresponding detail in the Rembrandt painting in the Night Watch. So this would then mean that I had a pair of images, one from the copy, one from Rembrandt, where all of the features are aligned, but they have different colors, they have different textures, they have different brushstrokes, and so on. And then this was the input to the third and final step, which I call sending the neural network to art school, where now, given these pairs of images, I could cut them each up into thousands of little overlapping tiles. And you can think of this almost like flashcards, where you could say, well, here's the front of the card, and this is how Rembrandt painted the detail. And on the back of the card is how London's painted the same detail. I designed a neural network that would let the computer guess what the Rembrandt tile would look like if it was only shown the tile from the copy. And after it got sufficiently good at this, in fact, when it couldn't get any better, so that is to say the training was done, then I could use the trained network to translate the entire copy into the palette, texture, and so on of Rembrandt. And then finally, I can throw away the middle because I've already got the Night Watch, and I don't need the inferior result of translating the London's copy to a Rembrandt-esque style, but I could retain the outer edges, which then were geometrically consistent with the original so that it would smoothly fade. It had all of the right colors. It had the right textures. In fact, a delightful little side note is that the neural network learned to hallucinate the craquelure. So it learned in its reconstruction to put cracks in the paint and to put it to make them the right color and the right scale, even though they weren't present in the small copy, which is on, of course, the cracks there are much smaller, but they have a different kind of geometry because it's on panel. So in the end, the idea is not to recreate the genius of Rembrandt, because I think that's impossible, but rather what we wanted to do was to give an impression of what the painting might have looked like if it had not been cut down.
Wow. Can you give us some idea of the sort of insight into Rembrandt's use of color you were able to infer from modeling and training the color transform?
Well, unfortunately, the neural network that learns to make this translation doesn't separate these factors. So I don't have color as a separate thing from texture, as a separate thing from, and so on. So really, it's this is oversimplifying, but broadly, it's a kind of black box where one image goes in, and that's the tile from the copy, and another image comes out, and that's the network's imagined Rembrandtization, if you will, of that tile. So I can say that it was interesting to see that the network learned how to imitate the kind of chiaroscuro shading technique for which Rembrandt is famous. Rembrandt's figures have this beautiful glow The faces kind of have a mysterious glow to them. In fact, in the film business, they even talk about Rembrandt lighting. And the background is quite subdued. And if you look carefully at the painting, you can see that the figures who are in front are very vivid and bright and saturated. And then the farther you move back into the painting, the more sedated and brown and unsaturated the figures become. And so this is just a trick that Rembrandt was very good at, but other painters knew as well, about how to kind of imbue a sense of depth into the painting that wouldn't otherwise be there. And the thing is that London's was not so good at that, or at least at this scale, he didn't really practice it so much. So the network had to learn how to take the sort of relatively flat images from the copy and make them more chiaroscuro shaded to make them more believably Rembrandt-esque.
So you mentioned training neural networks to predict the geometric and color and texture transformations. Were these neural networks off-the-shelf software? Were they difficult to apply to your problem?
They were not off the shelf, but these days there are a few key architectures, if you want. So when you're making a neural network, there's sort of two big parts to it. There's the so-called architecture, which is kind of a network diagram of how data flows through it, and data is transformed as it passes from node to node, from the input through possibly several hundred layers of nodes to the output. So that's the architecture. And then you have what are called the weights, which is the result of training the network to solve a particular task. So there are certain architectures that are well established. For example, I used a 50-layer ResNet, which is a residual network. This is the kind of network that's used to train computers to recognize, to perform classification, which is to say to recognize what object or what thing appears in a photo, like to say, oh, well, that's a fire truck, and that's a kitten, and that's a puppy. So you can take a network like that, and you can kind of copy it and wire it up in a funny way called a U-net. And a U-net, that is because it's shaped like a U. So you start from an image and it distills it all down into its essence, if you want. It places it into a latent space. And then it extrapolates back out to being a full image. So I utilize these kinds of architectures, which are well known in the literature. And then I had to tweak the wiring a little bit, and then I had to train them for my particular use case. So yeah, I mean, the total number of lines of code is probably fewer than 200 for the whole project, believe it or not. And that's because there are very powerful libraries now that let you build these neural networks at a very high level of abstraction. You can just sort of say, well, look, here's a part, here's a linear layer, here's a convolution layer, and so on. And then the rest is taken care of for you and compiled down into extremely efficient programs that will run on your GPU, your graphical processing unit, which makes them extremely fast. So I use PyTorch, which is one such library for designing these kinds of neural networks. Another big one is called TensorFlow. So PyTorch was originally made by Facebook AI. TensorFlow was from Google. So you have these sort of big players who are all trying to win hearts and minds by making very easy to use high-level neural network software so that a guy like me can still be in the game.
Roland.
Can I ask very briefly, digress into a legal question? You mentioned that there are 200 lines of code only for the whole project. Does somebody own that? Is that owned by the Rijksmuseum, by you, or is it retained by the people who licensed you the software?
All the software that I use is free software. So that's just kind of an ethic that is in the AI community broadly. So all of PyTorch is free and open source. I have an arrangement with the Rijksmuseum that enables me to retain copyright on software that I write, basically because the Rijksmuseum says, look, we're a museum, we don't need it, we don't care. But under normal circumstances, it would be owned, copyrighted by the Rijksmuseum. But yeah, I mean, I don't consider it proprietary in any sense. I mean, anyone who wants the code can ask me and I'll happily give it to them, because you don't work in a museum to make money.
But I want to add a little more context to that. I recall in our previous conversation, you mentioned that the Rijksmuseum has made available to the world its high definition images and has not copyrighted those or charged access fees, which is very different than some other institutions. Can you just give us a little bit of an insight into their thinking? Because that's an enormous policy decision.
Yeah, the Rijksmuseum, I think, has been the world leader in this. Other museums have followed. You can now do the same thing with images from the Met, for example. But many years ago, before I came to the Rijksmuseum, so before 2014, we've always had photographers who photograph our collection, but many museums have licensing departments, pay us so much to license a copy of your image. And the fact is that if you search Google for an image of a painting, you can find it. You can find it, and it will be bad color. It will have bad resolution. It will have been through the JPEG compression mill 17 times. It's just not good. So in general, both from a philosophical as well as a very Dutch pragmatic side, it made sense to make them all free and open, because we want it so that if someone has an image of a painting in our collection, it looks beautiful. And then people think, oh, yeah, I want to go to the museum and see that. Also, the analysis that they did said that the cost of running a licensing department would exceed the revenue generated by the licensing. So that's the pragmatic side. But yeah, essentially, the Rijksmuseum has made every image completely free. And so it's public domain even. And we continue to do so. I think there's more than 400,000 images that are available online. There's an API that you can use. So you can, search for images by artist or time period or medium or subject or whatever. And you'll get a direct link to download a high resolution image.
And these aren't just pretty images. These let you zoom in and actually see brushstrokes, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Most of the images are, let's say, 60 megapixels or so, which is, it's not an enormous number of pixels, but it's enough to make to really see what's going on nicely. And then in the meantime, at the museum, we're transitioning for various important works of doing super high resolution, where now it's many, many gigabytes per photo. The Night Watch, our highest resolution image is 5.6 terabytes. Wow. So that's not the kind of thing you can just have people downloading willy-nilly from the website, but still, it's available. And in fact, it's interesting, as a side note about my own history, the fact that the Rijksmuseum wanted to be so open with their digital assets is one of the major factors that attracted me to come work there, because I wanted my work to have the biggest possible impact. My mission statement is sort of to help the world access, conserve, and understand its cultural heritage. And so if you're working at a museum where they want everything to be accessible to everyone, then that's the way to do it.
Can I go back briefly to pick up something that I wasn't sure I fully understood? You said there are 17 figures or characters or personages in the Night Watch, but I wasn't sure whether that was 17 in what was cut down or 17 in the Reconstructed.
Oh, yeah. I should have mentioned that. I believe it is in its current state. So, yeah, there were two musketeers and a child that were cut off, but I wasn't counting those.
Okay.
If I recall the history correctly, I think the 17 were the people who contributed to paying Rembrandt what was at that point an exorbitant amount of money to create the painting. Some of the children and so on I don't think, paid anything.
Yeah, so only one child was cut off, but as far as I understand, the two musketeers who were cut off were paying for the picture. But the other thing to note is that the painting was painted in 1642, and it was cut down in 1715. So probably very few of the sitters were still alive when it was cut down, so they wouldn't have been around to object.
And you mentioned in your talk that there was a small face in the back row on the left that may be apocryphal, but it's possibly Rembrandt's face. Are you including that as the 17, or is he kind of the extra personage?
Yeah, that's among the 17 people in there. And in fact, if you try to count them, you probably won't get to 17 because there are some figures in the very, very back that are only depicted sort of part of their head. Another figure that most people miss, there's this girl really in this, glowing dress. And there is another, what looks like a girl whose head you can partially see right next to her head, but almost no one spots it. So yeah, in those cases, the neural network probably doesn't recognize it as a head, but it's not so important because they're not shaded in the way that I mentioned.
So there are other important paintings that have been damaged or destroyed. Have you discussed the application of your techniques to those works? Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea. But the problem here is in extending this to those cases is that this is really a translation problem that I'm solving rather than a composition problem. So you can imagine it's one thing to make a computer compose a novel, and it's a very different thing to make a computer translate a novel from English to French, let's say. So what I've done here is a kind of visual translation, whereas in the cases of paintings that are damaged, having been cut off, we don't have the source material to go back. In other words, I have a novel that was translated from English to French, and then pages of the English novel were lost, and I'm using the French version to go back. Sort of, that's what I have now. What is more likely to be useful in terms of extending this to other applications is to help understand what kind of effect different conservation treatments will have. Because broadly construed, what you have here is a pair of images that are semantically matched to each other, but they may have different textures, they may have different palettes, and they may have some geometric distortion between the two. And that's precisely the kind of thing that happens when you conserve a painting. You take off the varnish, you clean it, you remove old retouches, and so on. And so in this case, you would have a pair of images, and we have lots of these. We have lots of training data where we have the before conservation and after conservation. And so this system could then be used to teach a network how to imagine what it would look like if you would clean the painting, if you would take off the varnish and refresh it, if you would remove old retouches, and so on. And that could then lead to much better decision-making when it comes to trying to plan out a conservation treatment for a painting.
Does that mean that famous Dutch paintings that may have been lost in the Second World War, that we have photographs or copies of that somebody may have painted, you can't really reconstruct because we don't have any portion of the painting that survived for you to train the network on?
That's right. At least not with this technology. If you think about how AI might extend itself in the future, then it is true that certain artists have a way of depicting things. If you look at a Van Eyck person, you can tell that it's by Van Eyck, and it's not because the people looked like that. A Memling looks like a Memling because Memling has a kind of distortion that he applies to the faces. And so you could imagine learning how to undo that. And if you learned how Rembrandt takes a face and kind of, makes it look like a Rembrandt, then you could imagine a broad translation system that might take a photo or a copy where the entire original is now destroyed and sort of try to translate it back into the style of the original artist. But this would be, I think, far more speculative and wouldn't necessarily give us something that we can't do on our own, with our own imaginations, I guess. But as they say, prediction is difficult, especially about the future. So who knows? AI is evolving so fast that it can make your head spin. And these advances are really all amazing and delightful when applied to the conservation world or the cultural heritage world. So I'm really excited to see what's possible in even just a few years' time from now.
Well, why don't we look at one prediction? Because I'm guessing that while you were working on this, you were imagining how colleagues in the conservation field were going to react to what you did. What did you expect, and how have they in fact reacted? If we can compare your anticipation or forecast to how things have worked out so far.
Yeah, I expected that the conservators would be delighted with it, and that the art historians would be deeply skeptical of it. Conservators, because they are very enthusiastic about seeing new technologies and imagining how it might help their work. But broadly, the reception has been positive. I mean, this is, and I think a lot of that is about the framing, which is to say that this is not a project where I am saying, or anyone is saying, oh, well, we're recreating the genius of Rembrandt, and in the future we won't need geniuses like Rembrandt at all. The purpose of this exercise is to help one imagine what it might look like, and it has met that goal, because the fact is that when you add the missing pieces, as you mentioned, quite a lot was cut off of the left. When you make it a little taller, when you make it a little wider, and so on, the composition of the painting changes dramatically. It feels like a completely new painting, and it starts to make sense as a composition. You can see that the figures have a place to step into. They were a bit cramped before. When the sides were cut off, it seems that more was cut off on the left in order to put the two main figures dead center in the painting. But in the original, they were not dead center. They were going to step into the center, giving a sense of expectation and so on. And so the art historians, the curators, have really been positive about seeing that, because just looking at the Londons didn't quite do it, because it's such a small copy and because it's in the style of London's, and London's he's no Rembrandt.
I have to thank you also. You've clarified for me one of the boundaries between a painter and a photographer. A photographer has his own style or her own style, but the people they take all look very different. But your comment about, a Rembrandt or somebody else's depiction of certain faces tend to look not like the person necessarily looked, but as interpreted by their particular painting skills. You said you've constructed a 700 plus gigapixel image of the Night Watch with pixel size of 5 microns. For those of us that aren't able to sort of quantify and see in our minds what that really means, can you put that in terms that non-geeks and lawyers also will understand and explain, so that we can see it as you're seeing it?
Sure. Yeah. So when we talk about the resolution of a picture, one way is to refer to the so-called sampling resolution, and that means that you have this image in the virtual world, and then you have the thing that you photographed, the painting in the real world. And if you would move 1 pixel to the right in your image, then this corresponds to moving some distance on the object. So in the 716 gigapixel image of the Night Watch, if you move 1 pixel to the right, you're moving 5 micrometers to the right on the painting. The diameter of a human red blood cell is 8 micrometers. So to image 1 red blood cell, I would require a 2x2 array of pixels to fit it in. If you prefer thinking in DPI,
that's per inch.
LaserJet printer can do, let's say, 300 typically. A really fancy one could do 1200. This is photography at 5080 DPI. So 1 square inch would be 5,000 pixels wide and 5,000 pixels tall. So there would be 25 million pixels in 1 square inch.
And if the picture were only an inch by an inch, that would be quite a bit anyway. All right.
Yeah, that's right. And if you hear the resolution figure like that, it might just seem like, this is the cult of resolution. Like, why would you do that? And the answer is that, I'm a material scientist by training. So the way to understand the properties of material is to understand its structure at all scales. And when it comes to an oil painting, one of the key bits of the structure is the paint and the paint pigment particles. So to make an oil paint, you take some solid material and you grind it up into a powder with linseed oil, and then you paint with it. And so there's a structure that exists at this length scale. So when I photograph the painting at 5 micrometer resolution, I can see the individual paint pigment particles. Where there's a crack on the painting, I can look down into the crack like it's a canyon, and I can see the layers of paint without having to take a sample from the painting. When there's a conservation issue, for example, there's something called a lead soap, which is a sort of a little pimple that forms over hundreds of years and emerges on the face of the painting and then falls out and leaves a crater behind. I can see those, and I can't see them with lower resolution photography. Basically, this directly serves the interests of trying to decide what conservation treatment to perform, because then we can really see what's going on. And another nice aspect to it is you can see the minute details of how Rembrandt has failed to completely mix the paints that he's mixing on his palette in his brush, because then he'll make a stroke with his brush, and I can zoom in and see the individual unmixed paints in the paint strokes and so on. So you really can get so close that you can almost feel it being made.
I think in your talk, you even mentioned you were able to see some bits of glass in the paint.
Yeah, that's right. One of the kinds of pigments is called smalt, and smalt is basically blue cobalt glass that's been ground up into little bits. And glass, being amorphous, has a certain way that it fractures when it breaks. And so the process of grinding up smalt means that you get these little chips of glass. Just like when you drop a glass on the floor, that the pieces are very characteristic of glass. And you can zoom in and see the individual smalt particles, and you can tell that they're smalt because they're blue, of course, but also because they're shaped like cleaved glass.
So your keynote address at PyCon in 2021 explores how you captured and constructed the 716 gigapixel rendition of the Night Watch. For the non-geeks in the audience, PyCon is a conference for the Python programming language community. The techniques you outline are a tour de force of sophisticated applied mathematics. It says here in the fine print that your doctorate is in materials science. How does one construct a career path from materials to science to what you do now?
I have always been interested in way too many things. And in some ways, that's a strength, and in others, it's a weakness. So when I was trying to choose a major as an undergraduate, I was on a mission to try to find the most broad field that I could get my hands on. And when they pitched material science and engineering, they said, well, believe it or not, about a quarter of the scientists in the world today are working on some form or other of material science. Because material science basically unifies polymers and ceramics and metallurgy and composite materials and so on and so forth. And it spans all the length scales from atomic interactions all the way up to, what shape should I make my landing gear? So I majored in that. And then for my PhD, I was deeply fascinated in the question of why nature makes trees everywhere. Like lightning is shaped like a tree, and rivers are shaped like a tree, and cracks are shaped like a tree, and the vasculature in leaves and so on. So I was able to study this by simulating flow through porous media, and this led to writing big supercomputer simulations to simulate hundreds of thousands of different morphologies, and this then led naturally into thinking about solidification and coupling physics together. And in the end, the thing about cultural heritage for these days is that you have several factors coming together. You have new imaging techniques. I mean, the camera that I'm using can take a single photo of 400 megapixels. You have high-speed internet, you have incredibly fast computers, and no one has been doing anything in this field broadly. So it's a wide open field with really fun and interesting challenges that span many, many disciplines. And then I can just sort of run around and have fun while being useful, instead of sort of there's in some fields there's no more low-hanging fruit, you might say. In many university departments, people can't talk to each other in the next office because they're so specialized. But what appeals to me is crossing disciplines, and so and low-hanging fruit is always nice. So by moving into this field, I could plant a lot of trees, and then everything is low-hanging fruit.
So we've looked at the 20 micron image that you made and have already published, and it's amazing. It lets us see individual brushstrokes, as you've mentioned. Why then go to the 5 micron resolution?
Yeah, it's really because the features that we really would like to see to make our conservation decision are smaller than 20 microns. So, essentially, there are some resolutions where you can't tell that the painting has cracks, and then you zoom in and then you see that it has cracks. And there are some where you can see a brush stroke, but you can't see the fine scale. And so you zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. And as you continue to zoom in, new features will emerge that are relevant in ways that are of concern for the conservator. Basically, chemical processes that are happening that are causing a process of change. The ability to detect where very minute, what are called retouches. So in the past and today, when you perform a conservation treatment on a painting, where there's damage, the conservator may try to mask the damage by just painting over it. And so there is a resolution at which you can be sure that you will see all of those. And 20 microns is close to that, but you have to go smaller. And then why 5? Why not? Why not stop at something smaller? The answer is that the limiting resolution of the world's best camera is basically that. So 5 microns is 1-to-1. My pixel pitch, my sensor pitch on my camera is 5 microns. So I can basically make a 1-to-1 lens that doesn't magnify anything, doesn't reduce anything, and then I get 5 micron resolution photos.
So modern computers are fast and modern AI software is powerful, but neither is at the end of its expected evolution. If you were to apply similar techniques in 10 or 20 years' time, do you think the results would be different or better?
Do you mean the techniques for the reconstruction?
Or anything of the work you've done? Because you used AI not just in reconstruction, but in actually constructing the images, the photograph.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, everything is developing so rapidly that it's really difficult to predict even what we'll be able to do in 1 year. What I can say is that because of increases in internet speed and because people have more and more powerful devices in their hands, that's probably the most immediate relevant change for the public will be their ability to access these things. So there will be fully 3D, incredibly high resolution, multi-layered, what does the X-ray look like? What do the paint layers look like? What does the chemical composition look like? And so on, all embedded and accessible on your mobile device, which at some point may be an implant in your retina or your contact lenses or whatever. And then our ability to link what we do behind the scenes in the museum to the public will go up in a dramatic way. So I'm very interested in that. Also, something we haven't talked about here, but which is another huge interest of mine, is zooming out instead of zooming in. So we have 400,000 images from across Western art, and those have a relation to each other. They have a story. There are trends. And so if you're looking for an image and you can only describe it with words, how do you surface that? How do you find, I would love to be able to query to say, well, find me all of the paintings of a guy wearing red with a lion, and to have it surface then all of the St. Jerome paintings, for example. But we can't really do that now because of limitations in the ability of the computer to understand these sort of abstractions that are present in art. We can do it with photos, but the ability to see what's depicted in a drawing, for example, is still quite difficult. Because it's a drawing, it's very abstracted from the world as we perceive it. So I think that as far as the reconstruction, that it will likely be even more and more realistic. But at this time, it's sort of diminishing returns for that problem, I think. We could make it more realistic, but it seems to already sufficiently convey the idea of what the painting would have looked like. And so, yeah, it's good enough.
I don't know if you've heard this, but during the shutdown due to the pandemic, at least in the United States, a number of museums have discovered that because of their online offerings, students at schools across the country who've never had the opportunity to visit those museums because they couldn't afford the travel, they didn't live near it, are suddenly getting a chance to see and visit the museums. So the kind of work you're describing is really going, I hate to say that it's of use in pandemics only. I would hope they'll continue to do this even as we come out of the pandemic, which everybody hopes will be soon. But something else I'd like to ask your opinion on. The reconstruction that you said is on display only for this interregnum period of, 3 months?
Yeah, that's right.
Most of us in the world are not going to get a chance to have that experience of walking in, remembering, if we've been there before, remembering the impression the night watch made on us, and seeing how the painting shifts in perspective and how different it looks, which you've described. Can you tell us anything about how have people who have been able to go there, the Dutch public that has been able to visit, if it's been open yet? You gave us the reaction of conservators and historians, but you haven't told us what is the general Dutch public, how have they reacted to what you've done?
Also very, very positively. And a frequent question is, well, are you going to keep it? Because the thing is that these missing pieces that were done in the computer were then printed out on a canvas material, glued to metal plates, and placed around the actual night watch. So you can see them around the night watch. They're offset a little bit, so there's no confusion about what is original night watch and what's added. But they say, well, why don't you keep it up there? That will not happen because we are a museum of Dutch culture and art, and this is not Rembrandt. It would be very presumptuous, I think, to keep it up there. But my hope is that there will be some place where possibly a full-scale printout or other kind of reconstruction could be viewed, just to get the sense. Because what's really missing when you see it on your computer screen is the sheer size of it. I mean, this is a really big painting, and you just can't capture that with a small screen. But yeah, of course, the small version will live on the website, so you'll be able to see that. But yeah, unfortunately, you've got to get here before October 13th if you want to see it in person.
If I'm not mistaken, I don't remember if it was the Night Watch or another painting in the Netherlands that was knifed at one point. Will your images of the Night Watch or any other paintings that the Rijksmuseum is doing at these super high resolutions be a kind of emergency room treatment if any other damage like that happens to a painting, that you will be able to fix it and in that sense keep it on view as it was, rather than saying, well, this is not Rembrandt, this was not, Van Dyck or somebody else's work.
Yeah, I mean, one of the fundamental sort of pillars of conservation is documentation. Just documenting what the painting is like. And sometimes unexpected things happen. Sometimes your cathedral burns down. Sometimes your painting is stolen or it's destroyed in a bombing campaign or who knows what. One would never be able to replace a great work of art if it's destroyed, but still having a knowledge of what it looked like to the nth degree in 3 dimensions, chemically, and so on, it would be a real pity if we didn't do that and then something bad happened. Of course, as you know, Notre Dame, I believe, is the reconstruction is assisted by the fact that there were drone photos, high-resolution drone photos and laser scans that were taken before the fire. But the higher resolution, the better. And of course, if it's partially damaged, if an artwork is partially damaged, then the ability of a restorer to go in and see exactly what it used to look like is dramatically improved if you have this very high resolution data, as well as having 3D, as well as having knowledge of which pigments were used and so on. So the more data, the better.
we've been talking a lot about AI and its forecasting and its predicting. Humans have a rather good capacity to exercise hindsight. As you use hindsight and you look back at the work you did on Operation Nightwatch, is there anything you would have done differently if you were starting out now, knowing all that you've learned from doing it?
What I can say is that everything is harder than it looks. But of course, that's a sort of universal refrain. So the amount of effort that was required to actually pull off this 700 plus gigapixel photo is a lot higher than we ever thought. The depth of field of the camera is incredibly narrow. You basically have 1/8 of a millimeter depth of field. So if it's too close or too far, it will be blurry. And the painting,
even with the camera, the painting moving and the air currents, with that shallow a depth of field, you were able to deal with that.
Yeah, that's right. So basically, I have to chase the painting a little bit. And what I didn't mention in the talk is the fact that moving the camera to place it in front of the painting blocks the air currents that are naturally occurring in the room. And so I ended up having to model that because the way that the painting will move is predictable. So when you block the air currents, the painting moves away from you in a certain predictable way because the air currents were pushing the painting. Yeah, it's complicated, but these kinds of things, just the tiny details on the tiny details on the tiny details that you need to pull this off mean that it's a good thing to have done, but not necessarily a good thing to be doing. It was real suffering. So I'm glad that I only have to do it probably twice, because I can expect that when the conservation treatment is done, we'll do the whole thing over again. The same resolution before and after. Okay. And now I know about all the pitfalls, but some of these things I couldn't have predicted.
I have to tell you, the four of us feel it's an honor and a privilege to have been able to have you as a speaker. Your work is extraordinary, but as a material scientist, where you say you wanted to be able to go across all the dimensions from very small to very large, you've done that in this talk for us in a really, if you'll pardon the expression, illuminating way. And I want to thank you very, very much. I have thoroughly enjoyed this. Mark?
That was astounding, and thank you. This was eye-opening in so many ways. We thank the American Bar Association for their generous sponsorship and support of the production of this podcast. Our theme music was composed and performed by the very talented Ben Rosenblum. We welcome questions and comments from listeners. Send email to comments@mindthegapdialogues.com. We read all comments and questions and will try to respond in the letters section of a future episode. If you are writing about a particular episode, please do mention the specific episode number. Please also do include pronunciation tips to help us properly say your name when we reply in a subsequent episode. See you next time on Mind the Gap, Dialogues on AI. The views expressed in these podcasts are solely those of the speakers and not of their employers or organizations.
Thank you for listening to the ABA Business Law Section's podcast series, To the Extent That. The section offers a robust collection of content. To explore more about this topic, or to learn about joining the section, visit ambar.org/bizlaw. That's BIZLAW.